Chapter 6, The Whistling Mountain, by Mary Daem. The rest of the afternoon was windy and cold. David stayed in the house and read for a while. Then he sorted out his belongings and helped his mother as she sorted out hers. There didn't seem to be anything special he really wanted to do, and he missed his friends. "I wish I'd brought my bicycle," he said half a dozen times, though he knew there was no place where he might ride it. "Haven't we even got television here, Mother?" he asked, remembering that it was time for a show which he was fond of. "Try and see what you can get on the radio, dear," she suggested. David tried, but all that came out were squawks and squeals. "Oh, gee, Mother," David complained unhappily. "There are so many things that we haven't got here." "I know, but we'll just have to make the best of it." David was sure his mother was missing things too. "We'll get used to doing without television and having odd noises on the radio. This is the life your father has chosen, and we're going to like it." David looked carefully at his mother's face. She looked as though she was trying very hard to keep a smile there. He decided to stop complaining. He went into his bedroom and looked at his mountain. It seemed very big and very high, and he wanted more than almost anything to see what it was like up on top. He was still standing there daydreaming when he heard his father calling him. Mr. Dunn sounded angry. "David, come here. Are you responsible for this?" His father was standing beside the trail, and the trail was covered with water. David didn't need to be told where the water came from. He knew. "Oh, Dad, I dammed the creek and I forgot all about it when Mother called me for dinner. Gosh, it's made an awful mess, hasn't it? I'm ever so sorry." David poked a hole in the dam with a large stick lying nearby, and the water went rushing into the old channel, flowing harmlessly beside the trail. "Look at it," Mr. Dunn pointed, and David could see that the water had found its way from the trail to the corral. There was a small pond of water right in the gateway. "With the horses coming tomorrow, you certainly picked a good time to mess with water. They'll turn that corral into a sea of mud if it doesn't drain by morning." David felt terrible. He didn't seem to be able to do anything right. He was very quiet until bedtime, and he went to bed without being told more than twice. He lay awake for a long time, watching the moonlight shining on his mountain, and he was homesick for city lights and city noises. The rattle of the stove lid wakened him. He bounced out of bed. "Have the horses come yet?" he called. "Of course not. It's only 6 o'clock. Better go back to bed for a while. The horses won't get here for hours." David stood uncertainly and shivered. His feet were cold. He went to the window and looked outside. Everything looked dull and dark, and there was no light on top of the mountain. It must be very early. No wonder he was still so sleepy. He jumped back into his bed and burrowed under the covers. He was asleep almost at once and slept until his mother called him for breakfast. "Dad, do you think I could go down to Swiftwater with you and watch the horses being unloaded? I wouldn't get in the way." "I'd really like to take you," Mr. Dunn replied, "but don't you remember that I told you the horses are half wild? The train trip will frighten them, and it's been a long time since I handled horses. The trail gang will be there to help me, of course, but I just wouldn't have time to watch you too, David." "Maybe I could help you, Dad." Mr. Dunn smiled. "I'm afraid not. It's rather a tricky business. You see, I'll be riding one of the horses. The others will be tied behind in a long string, and the trail gang will follow to make sure that none of the horses get loose. The horses will be so nervous that anything might scare them, or spook them, as the men say. They might pull away and gallop right into the bush, and we would have to spend days looking for them. You stay right here with your mother and watch for us from the porch." David's mouth dropped, and he put his last forkful of pancake back on his plate. "Perhaps you can coax your mother to walk down to the store with you tomorrow when she's not so busy getting settled. I want you to get used to finding your way, but not alone. There might be something you want at the store, like peppermints or bubble gum." His father placed a shiny dime beside David's plate. "Do you really think it would be safe for us to go alone, Bill?" Mrs. Dunn asked. "What if we were to meet a bear?" Mr. Dunn winked at his son. "If you meet a bear and it bites you, bite it right back. David will be good protection. He talks so much that he'll scare them away. But seriously, Mary, I don't think there's any danger. Just make a bit of noise as you walk along. The horses will have made so much confusion today that there won't be a bear left in the country. David looked thoughtful. Just make a noise, his father had said. Now, if only he could whistle. A bear would be frightened away by a whistle. He gave a little sigh. I won't let anything hurt you, Mother, he boasted. If a big old bear came along, I'll yell like anything. I think I'd be too scared to make a sound, his mother laughed. Now, if you're going out, be sure to take your sweater. Oh, Mother, David exclaimed. Mothers were always reminding you to put on this or take off that. He scraped the crusts from his plate and put them in his pocket. Perhaps he could coax a squirrel from a tree. From the top step, he watched his father tramping down the muddy trail to Swiftwater. He watched him until he came to the bend in the trail and stopped and waved, and David waved back. He really wished he were going. Golly, there didn't seem to be anything for him to do. He almost wished that it were time for school to start. He'd have to be allowed to go down the mountain then. From the steps, he looked down to the corral and saw that it was still muddied from the creek water. He felt a twinge of guilt. He noticed the big stumps left in the corral. They were very large and higher than his head. His father had explained that the trees that had grown there had been cut down in the wintertime when the snow was very deep. It was because of the deep snow that the houses and the school down in Swiftwater were built so high up, and why there were so many steps to everything. He looked again at the stumps and tried to imagine them with deep snow all around them. He went down the steps and wandered closer to get a better look. One of the stumps was considerably higher than the others. David measured himself against it and found it was quite a bit taller than he was. He walked around it and stopped. On the far side of the trunk, part way up, he saw a hole. It seemed big enough to stick his foot into. He tried and was able to scramble right on top of the stump. He stood up straight and looked around. There was his mountain towering over the treetops, and from where he stood he could see a way down the trail too. This was fun. He put one hand in his pocket and found a bread crust. He laid it beside him for the squirrels and chipmunks. He waited very quietly, but he could neither see nor hear any small animal, so he slid down from the stump. There was a flash of feathers in the sunlight, and a bird with brilliant blue and black plumage snatched at the crust and flew with it into the high branches of a big pine tree. Hey, that's not for you, David called indignantly. But the bird held the crust in his claws and pecked at it hungrily. David tried placing another bit of crust on the stump top, and this time the bird snatched it almost before it left his fingers. David watched as it flew up into a tree again and poked the crust into the crotch of a tree branch, and then waited eagerly for another. Why are you storing it? David exclaimed to himself. He placed the rest of his crusts on the stump and then watched delightedly as they were all taken away. Next he went into the barn and poked around, and then into the storage shed and looked at all the equipment. He was content with just looking, and the time passed quite quickly. He wandered outside again, and the sun was much higher in the sky. The squirrel sat on the big stump, holding a pine cone and turning it in his paws. He dropped it as David came near and went running up the trunk of the big pine, scolding as he went. David wanted that pine cone. Perhaps his mother would like to see it. He put his foot in the hole of the stump and again scrambled on top. There was a tiny pile of husks that the squirrel had left, and the pine cone partially stripped. David lifted it in his hands and looked at it carefully. That was the squirrel scolding still. A glimpse of something moving made David turn his head. Far down the trail, the horses were coming. David was excited. He could see his father astride the lead horse, holding a long rope in one hand. Around the bend, the other horses came, one by one, and they were coming most unwillingly. To one side rode a tall man in a wide-brimmed hat, and at the very end, the other member of the trail gang urged the horses forward. David sat perfectly still and watched as they plodded up the trail. David had never seen his father on a horse before, and just as the lead horse came abreast of the corral, He stood up to get a better look. That did it. The horse started in terror, whirled on its hind legs, and Mr. Dunn was thrown to the ground, the rope flying out from his hand. There was a wild pounding of hooves as the horses broke in several directions, scattering camping equipment willy-nilly into the bushes. David's father jumped quickly to his feet, unhurt, and the other men raced off after the runaways. One of the horses turned and ran straight into the corral, brushing David so closely that it nearly knocked him off the stump. It was the biggest horse of all, and its nostrils flared red, and its eyes were rolling. David was terrified, and he clung to the stump with all his strength. "Whoa, who's there? Something sure spooked that horse. Get them stopped or they'll soon be at the top of the mountain." Men's angry voices were shouting, and the vicinity of the corral was a mad medley of horses and men. "What in blazes scared that horse?" questioned Barney, one of the trail gang, holding tightly to the end of a lasso. David's father brushed the dust off his trousers and put his hand on the corral gate, and as he did so, he saw David, huddled on the top of the stump. "David!" His voice thundered. "What are you doing up there? Didn't I tell you to stay away from here? Don't you dare move until we get these horses settled. Now get in that cabin and stay there for the rest of the day," he ordered when he could safely leave the horses. "You simply have to learn to obey the rules for your own safety. You've caused us hours of extra work, collecting the equipment that's scattered, and I could easily have been killed. From now on, stay away from the corral and do as you're told." "I hate this place," David shouted when he was alone with his mother. "Why did we ever come here, anyway?" That's the end of chapter 6.